Hey everyone, and welcome to this explainer. Today, we're taking an inside-out journey into the remarkable, continuously flowing fluid that literally keeps us alive. Yup, we're talking about blood. It's something most of us only really think about when we accidentally get a paper cut or when we're sitting in a doctor's office, right? But today, we are going to uncover the sheer mechanical genius of what is pumping through your veins right at this very second. Here's our roadmap for today. We'll start by exploring the river of life. Then we'll meet the cellular workforce, look into the history of transfusions, decode your blood test, and finally, look beyond the numbers. All right, let's jump right into part one, the river of life. It's pretty incredible to think about, but blood actually makes up roughly 8% of your total adult body weight. For females, we're talking about 4 to 5 liters, and for males, around 5 to 6 liters. This massive internal transport system is slightly basic. Its pH is strictly maintained right between 7.35 and 7.45. And it's actually 4.5 to 5.5 times thicker or more viscous than water. That specific thickness is absolutely vital, by the way, because if your blood flows too easily or conversely with too much resistance, it can severely strain your heart. Now, if you were to take a vial of that blood and spin it down in a centrifuge, it perfectly separates by density into two main parts. Sitting right at the top, making up about 55% of the volume, is this clear, yellowish fluid called plasma. Think of plasma as the river water. It's a mix of water, electrolytes, and vital proteins like albumin, which controls fluid balance, and antibodies that give you immunity. Then, packed at the very bottom, making up the other 45%, are what we call the formed elements. Moving on to part two, the cellular workforce. So, let's zoom in on that bottom 45%. This is the microscopic workforce navigating our plasma river, and it's categorized into three primary components. First, you have the highly abundant, disc-shaped red blood cells. They act as the cargo ships for oxygen. Then, you've got the larger, uniquely shaped white blood cells serving as the immune-defending patrol boats. And finally, those tiny little fragments scattered all around, the clot-forming platelets. Let's look a little closer at the red blood cells, or erythrocytes. These are essentially specialized transport vessels packed with a protein called hemoglobin, which is the actual stuff that binds to the oxygen. And here is something that is absolutely wild to me. To make maximum room for this oxygen cargo, a maturing red blood cell actually ejects its own nucleus and its mitochondria. That means it physically cannot consume the very oxygen it is meant to deliver. It also gives the cell this biconcave, sunken shape, which lets it stretch and fold as it squeezes through your body's tiniest capillaries. But, there's a massive trade-off for this extreme specialization. Because they don't have a nucleus or ribosomes, these incredibly hard-working red blood cells literally cannot repair themselves. Their outer membranes become increasingly fragile, which means they only survive for about 120 days. After that, they get trapped in narrow channels, mostly in the spleen, where scavenger cells called macrophages break them down and recycle their components so your body can build fresh ones. Now, let's talk about your body's defense system, the white blood cells, or leukocytes. These guys are highly varied, and scientists divide them into two main camps, granulocytes and agranulocytes. Granulocytes, like neutrophils, have these visible little granules inside them, and they are your primary frontline defense for destroying bacteria. On the other hand, agranulocytes, like lymphocytes, coordinate your larger immune system, secrete antibodies, and specifically go after things like viruses and cancer cells. Rounding out our cellular workforce, we have platelets, and what's fascinating is that technically, these aren't even whole cells. They're just tiny fragments broken off from much larger bone marrow cells. But their job is monumental. When a blood vessel breaks, platelets immediately act as first responders. They secrete chemicals to constrict the vessel and reduce blood flow, they physically clump together to form a temporary plug, and they release clotting factors to permanently seal up the injury. Okay, part 3. A history of transfusions. We totally take understanding this complex fluid for granted today, right? It's a very modern luxury. Humanity's quest to figure it out and share it to save lives spans centuries of dramatic and, frankly, sometimes terrifying trial and error. Consider this. William Harvey only figured out how blood circulates in 1628. By 1667, doctors in France and England were actually trying to transfuse sheep blood into human patients. As you can probably guess, that didn't end well. In the 1870s, physicians even tried using cow's milk as a blood substitute. No way, right? It wasn't until 1818 that a British obstetrician pulled off the first successful human-to-human transfusion to treat a mother bleeding after childbirth. But the real game changer? That was 1901, when Carl Landsteiner discovered human blood groups. That finally explained why so many earlier transfusions failed due to incompatibility. And that breakthrough paved the way for modern medicine, leading right into the massive national blood programs of the 1940s during World War II. Which brings us to part 4, decoding your blood test. So now that we know the science and the history, how do doctors actually use this information during your routine checkup? Well, when you get a complete blood count, a CBC, it usually just looks like a massive wall of confusing numbers. But doctors cut right through that noise and look at the big 3 first. They check your white blood cell count to look for infections, they check your hemoglobin or hematocrit to see how well you're carrying oxygen, and they check your platelet count to assess clotting risks. If those big 3 look normal, most of the other numbers on that page are actually much less clinically important. You've probably seen terms like hematocrit or hemoglobin flagged on your own chart. Basically, hemoglobin measures the actual oxygen-carrying protein, while hematocrit measures the physical percentage of your blood volume that's made up of packed red cells. Doctors use these 2 metrics interchangeably to figure out if you have anemia, which just means you don't have enough oxygen capacity, or in much rarer cases, if you're actually producing too many red blood cells. Now, if your hemoglobin or hematocrit is abnormal, that's when your doctor puts on their medical detective hat. They start looking at other numbers called red cell indices to figure out exactly why. MCV tells them if your red blood cells are unusually large or small. MCHC gives them context about the density of the hemoglobin inside, and RDW shows the variation in the sizes of the cells. But remember, these indices are just tools to explain an abnormality. They aren't the primary headline of your overall health. And finally, part 5, beyond the numbers. It can be incredibly stressful to log into a patient portal and see a bolded red abnormal result next to one of your cell counts. But it's vital to remember that a single CBC is really just a snapshot in time. Medical professionals view these numbers with a much wider lens. Minor fluctuations in your white blood cells or platelets are incredibly common. They could just be a temporary response to stress, iron deficiency, or even just recovering from a mild cold you forgot you had. Also, be careful with those white blood cell percentages on your chart. A percentage might look high just because a different type of cell temporarily dropped. That is exactly why doctors care way more about your absolute counts, and more importantly, your long-term trends, rather than one isolated test. To wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with this final thought. Think about that miraculous 120-day cycle of rebirth happening inside your veins right now. Your body is constantly breaking down old cells and building fresh, life-sustaining ones. Since this resource is continuously renewing itself, ask yourself, how many lives could you impact by simply visiting a local clinic and sharing this vital river of life with someone whose body desperately needs it? Thanks for learning with me today.